This is The Raid, exposing the dark world of America's deportation machine. I'm your host, John Carlos Frey. On the podcast today is Silky Shah. She's the executive director of an organization called Detention Watch Network. It's a U.S.-based national coalition of organizations and individuals dedicated to abolishing the immigration detention system through collective advocacy, education, and grassroots organizing. Detention Watch Network aims to end the detention and deportation of immigrants and promote racial equity in immigration policy. They provide resources, training, and strategic support to fight against the inhumane conditions in detention centers, working to create a society where people can live and move more freely.
It's really great to be here with you. Detention Watch Network, we are a national coalition. So we're a membership coalition, and we have organizations that we work with all across the country, ranging from groups like the ACLU or Amnesty International to legal service providers who are in places like Arizona, like the Florence Immigrant and Refugee Rights Project, to completely grassroots organizations that all are concerned with the issue of immigration detention. And, immigration detention has grown significantly. Detention Watch Network started in 1997, which was after the passage of the 1996 laws, these two really harsh laws, immigration laws that ended up really kind of exploding the detention system, where we saw it sort of double in size in a matter of years. And that was sort of a precursor to 9/11, where a lot more money and, political will went into growing the detention system. And then after 9/11, it started to evolve, where a lot more community members, people who themselves had either been detained or their family members had been detained, started to engage with the work. A lot of our work focuses on working with local organizations, working with people on the ground who are seeing what's happening in their communities, people being targeted, being swept up into the detention system. The conditions inside detention, this last year, the number of deaths have really, really skyrocketed. And we're so concerned about, when the system grows like this, the conditions just deteriorate more and more. They're always bad, but they're even that much more bad now. And doing work to get people out of detention, and also working with, local officials, city councils, county commissioners, and state legislatures to say, no, we don't want this to happen in our communities. And so doing that work locally. So our work is organizing on the ground, and then also advocacy at the state level, at the federal level, working with members of Congress, depending on the administration, sometimes working within administration, and trying to really put pressure, and then doing a lot of narrative work and sort of really understanding, why do we have this detention system? What are the reasoning behind it? And how can we really help people understand that it's not something that should exist? It's something that we don't believe people should be detained for their immigration status.
So you said that you started your network or your organization back in the 90s when the detention system kind of started or exploded. How many people are we talking about in detention at that time?
In sort of around that period of time, we went from having some like 8,000 people in detention at any given time to, by 1998, it was, like 15,000, more than 15,000 people in detention. By the time we get to the year 2000, around 9/11, it's about 20,000. So that's where we're going. It's starting to expand. Detention as we know it didn't really exist. Mostly people would be held in detention for a day or two and then be released on their quote unquote own recognizance while they go through their immigration proceedings. People are just in detention to sort of determine their immigration status, or awaiting deportation, or awaiting appeal on their case. And so for a long time, detention wasn't really, people would spend a couple of days in detention. Not many people would go into the system for long periods of time.
And that was mostly to assess them individually, right? I mean, we were taking a look at their background, whether or not they had a criminal record, what their immigration status may or may not be, do they qualify, just to kind of get the paperwork all in order to allow them then to go through the process. It wasn't this sort of heavy criminal kind of finger pointing at these individuals that needed to be incarcerated.
Well, and that's true. And what started to change is in the early 1980s, there was a large influx of Haitian migrants who were coming as economic migrants who were really looking, who were seeking asylum, but because of the conditions in Haiti, where the US was backing a dictatorship. And so in response, you saw the US saying, no, actually, we don't believe these people to be worthy of seeking asylum, so we're going to indefinitely detain them. In particular, Haitian migrants, Black migrants. There was a race component to this in every single way. And that was when we started to see the growth of this sort of more longer term detention where people would spend, weeks, months, sometimes years in detention, and the detention system started to grow. And at the time, the US Immigration and Naturalization Service, which is sort of like the precursor to ICE and a few other agencies within the Department of Homeland Security, didn't really have its own facilities. And so they were using all these federal prisons or other sites. But because the laws were changing and because there was much more, the war on crime, the war on drugs was really growing, those federal prisons, those other facilities started to become overcrowded. And so, in the 1980s, they were like, well, we need our own immigration detention centers. And so that's when you start to see the rise in immigration detention, a few thousand people being detained at any given time. In the 80s, the laws become harsher and harsher. And it's in fact in 1988 in the Anti-Drug Abuse Act that was passed that year where we first see mandatory detention law. So there's this really strong relationship between policy and federal legislation in the war on drugs and immigration enforcement and immigration becoming that much harsher, immigration enforcement becoming harsher. And so all of that's happening. And then you get to the 90s and, you go to the crime bill passes in 1994. There's the war on crime, this sort of fervor around national security because of the Oklahoma City bombing. All of those things culminate in these two laws in 1996 that really shifted things, where prior to that period, actually a lot of people who were, what we call green card holders, legal permanent residents, had a right to have a fair day in court. They could, go through the process and say, okay, maybe I have this past criminal conviction, or maybe I have some other violation of my immigration status, and I can go before a judge and make my case. But after 1996, the paradigm shifted from resident versus non-resident to citizen versus non-citizen. And so now, like overnight, and you talk to the people who started Detention Watch Network back in the day, it was basically people who had been in the country for 20 years because of some past conviction, a drug conviction or something. They were suddenly fast-tracked to deportation. They didn't actually have opportunities for relief because of the harshness of these laws. And then you also see more people, because it became even harder for people to adjust status because of these laws, more people feeling like they were trapped in the country. Like if they left, they couldn't come back. And so that's the other thing that happens. It starts to grow the undocumented population in the country as well.
And in addition to that, this concept of private prisons was non-existent as well, right? So then after 9/11, we start to see corporations coming in and building these massive for-profit prisons too. It was all run by the federal government, like the federal prison system, as you say, before that.
So the thing about private prisons that I think is important to recognize is that so much about private prisons is it's about the rise in neoliberalism. So when in the 1980s, when Reagan was very committed to a sort of, doctrine of small government, there was an opening for these sort of parasite-esque private prison companies where they were like, oh, they want to build new immigration detention centers. They actually this is our opportunity to kind of get in on this. And in fact, Core Civic, which was originally called Corrections Corporation of America, its first facility, its first private prison was actually an immigration detention facility in Houston, Texas, which is my hometown. And it opened in 1984. And that's the Houston Processing Center. It still exists today. So that's when you first see private prisons starting to take shape. The first facility that the GEO Group, which was formerly called Wackenhut, opened in 1987 is the Aurora Detention Center, which is in Colorado. And these facilities still exist to this day. And so you saw this sort of symbiotic relationship between the private prison companies and the federal government, where the federal government was like, well, we want small government, but actually what we're going to do is just outsource immigration detention to both private prison companies, but also to a lot of county jails across the country in order to sort of grow the detention system.
The narrative that you're describing and the paradigm shift that you're describing is that somehow immigrants, regardless of their legal status, whether they were undocumented or green card holders, were portrayed as being criminally oriented, right? They may be the source of these crimes. They may be, we don't know who's amongst us. The finger pointing started towards immigrants pretty heavily. Do you see that narrative of immigrant equals criminal kind of causing this increase in detention? Or was it a for-profit model? I mean, what came first here?
I mean, I think it's absolutely the narrative, the good immigrant versus the bad immigrant, the sort of public safety narrative, the national security narratives, all of those things play a role. And I think the thing to understand is that this was the period of time when the US became the world's leading incarcerator. So narratives around crime were kind of taking over in so many ways. It was the era of the quote unquote super predator that Hillary Clinton sort of promoted. It was the era of broken windows. It was the era when we went from having, some 300,000 people in prison in 1970 to 2 million people in prison by the year 2000. It skyrocketed. So all of that was then placed on immigrants. It was like, here is another population to warehouse. This is a question of like, what do we do with these populations? And these narratives played into this idea of immigrants being a problem, but there was tension around it because there is the good immigrant versus the bad immigrant. Oh, we need immigrants for labor. We need, they're like that. One of the hard things about this is that so many of the narratives are immigration is about public safety and national security, which is just a complete lie that's told to us all the time, when immigration is about labor, it's about family relationships, and it's about seeking refuge.
What changed? Did immigrants start committing more crimes? Were they the source of terrorist attacks? Did they bomb Oklahoma? Were they in charge of crime in city streets? And I don't see them all of a sudden becoming more criminal than they were before, but they're being treated as if they were more criminal than they were before. They started being the source of crime, it seemed like to me, or at least being scapegoated.
Well, I think the scapegoating is really significant. And I mean, that definitely is part of the conversation today. But, in so many instances, politicians, elected leaders will sort of like, capitalize on moral panics. Like, this is a really egregious thing that happened. And now we're going to apply really harsh law to large categories of people that had nothing to do with it because of the Oklahoma City bombing, which we all know was not conducted by an immigrant, but actually, somebody who's formerly in the U.S. military, a white man who was formerly in the U.S. military. But then, there are, and of course, 9/11 is such a big impetus for so much of this. But a lot of it is this sort of sense of, politicians feeling the need to kind of have more legitimacy. And so here's this thing that happens, and safety is such an easy way to kind of garner support, public safety, national security. And so their way of gaining legitimacy is by kind of pushing these moral panics and say, okay, we're going to extend state control even further by creating even harsher laws against immigrants or against poor people, working class people, Black, Indigenous people, like the people who end up in the prison system or end up deported. And that extension of state control, and it becomes a sort of cycle of like, we're just going to keep doing that. And this is what we've seen over time.
Can I stop you there for a second? I don't hear you saying it, but I'm hearing you say it, that it's a political construct, what you're describing here, that if I'm going to run for office, I'm going to demand harsher penalties for those people who are brown, who are Black, who are other, who don't speak that language. I'm going to run on a platform of harsher penalties for those individuals because we don't know who they really are, right? So I can scapegoat them right into my new office, right into my new political office. And I think people started jumping on that bandwagon because it's an easy sell, isn't it? To scare people into believing that immigrants are responsible for all the crime and taking your jobs, and you know the list. Is it that?
Yeah, no. I mean, I think that's definitely a big part of it. And I think, fast forwarding to kind of how we got into these conditions, and there's a lot more to say about this, but, one of the big elements of the last few years was the strategy of the Texas governor, Greg Abbott, of busing migrants to New York City and Chicago and DC and Denver and these sort of like quote unquote sanctuary cities. And what it started to do was actually show the sort of fault lines, show like the weakness of the social safety nets for communities in New York and especially like in the south side of Chicago, where Black communities were not getting the resources they need. And that sort of also did the work, especially because you didn't have other politicians who were challenging this and who were saying, no, like, how do we support immigrants who are being bused to these communities? And it fractured and it kind of gave way to that scapegoating for people who are like, well, I need housing, I need, food, I need support in this way. But no, you're giving it to these quote unquote new immigrants.
That was the purpose, though, wasn't it? I mean, that was a purposeful narrative. I think there were even hotlines that you could call to call in crimes committed by immigrants. The federal government had set up hotlines for you to call in if somebody that you suspected of being an immigrant, you could call in. I mean, I don't know of any other call number that you can do that for a white person necessarily, but immigrant equaled criminal seemed to be a growing and potent narrative. To what end? Was it just for political gain? Or it doesn't seem like there was any evidence behind it. I'm just trying to figure out, am I going to just run on a scapegoat kind of a political platform so I can get elected by scaring you? Is that pretty much what the end game was here?
I mean, I I write about this a lot in my book, where I kind of unpack a lot of the sort of like, there's also like liberal narratives at play. I think sometimes it's very easy for us to say, oh, this is about Trump, or during the, post 9/11 era, this is about Bush. And these are these, and it's absolutely true. And I think it's important to understand those conditions. But part of the thing that was so challenging about the Obama and the Biden years is that narrative of the good immigrant versus bad immigrant actually fed into this idea that there are certain immigrants that are deserving of this treatment. And when you keep sort of pushing that idea, it actually dehumanizes those immigrants that they're fighting for. And so what ends up happening, and this is what we saw with the border militarization, I mean, obviously after this last summer, it's levels that even for me, having done this work for over 20 years, it's hard for me to fathom. But back when there was an effort for comprehensive immigration reform in 2013 during the Obama years, a lot of that good immigrant versus bad immigrant narrative was at the center of it. And by the time the Senate actually passed a bill, which, never fully became law or never became law, they added this huge amount of money just for border militarization. And again, so when you look at the border and you're like, oh, these people aren't deserving, it doesn't make it easier to make the case for the people who are living in New York or Chicago or the other places. So there's this sort of cycle, and that's part of the problem, is that the narratives always leaned into there are certain people that are quote unquote bad that don't deserve this. And when you end up saying that constantly in the quote unquote worst of the worst, it just ends up lending itself to going after all immigrants, which is what we're seeing this year. This is what has happened in 2025.
And it feels like Trump, if we jump into the Trump era, he's just standing on the shoulders of what came before him. He has turned up the volume a bit, but this infrastructure of private prisons and detention systems and laws on the books and scapegoating immigrants was done by Democrat and Republican president before him on down the list. So all he's done is just make it worse.
I think that's absolutely true. I think there's, it's challenging because I think there's a lot of like energy to be like, this is so much worse. It is so much worse. And I don't want to take away from how bad it's getting. Like by the end of the Obama years, detention went up significantly. It went to 40,000 people in detention any given time. Obama really just followed the Bush path and didn't actually do much to make the system better, and brought back family detention, did. And, under the first Trump administration, it went up to 55,000 at any given time at one point. And that was the highest we had seen the detention system. Now we're nearing 70,000. I think, yes, it's absolutely true that this is building on what's happened before. There's a jumping of scale of what we've seen, but then there are things that are a departure. And I think there are kind of like trial balloons for this administration to see what they can sort of get away with. And one of those, it came early on after inauguration with the executive orders and everything. But, we're going to start detaining people at Guantanamo Bay. And then they started detaining people at Secot in El Salvador. Which honestly is a precursor to sort of the conditions we're in right now around Venezuela. But I think and then we're going to target student activists who were protesting in solidarity with Palestine, who, were essentially being targeted for quote unquote thought crimes. So I think it's important to see those as significant departures. And now, the Trump administration has some a few dozen agreements with other parts of the world, the other countries, to have people be deported to third countries that they have no relationship to, like in really harsh conditions, like in South Sudan or Eswatini, or these places that people hadn't even heard of before. And so there are all of that. There's these really kind of, like I said, sort of policy departures that are so harsh, that are there to instill fear. That's what they're there. That's what they're doing. And then at the same time, the private prisons are growing. There's so many more county jail contracts again. That's a lot of the work that we were able to do before, is sort of limit those. But now they're kind of coming back up. They're talking about warehousing immigrants in warehouses and working with the U.S. Navy to do that. And so those things, I think, are sort of in line with what we've seen before, but it's a jumping of scale. But then there's that other thing where you're like, how far are they going to go in terms somebody could be detained and end up in thousands and thousands of miles away, having no sort of recourse and get stuck. And there's people still detained in South Sudan who've been there for months and can't just get to their home country because of the conditions there.
So let's jump into some of 2026 of what's happening today. The first thing on my list would be this thing that is playing out in the courts, where a lot of judges are sort of refusing this idea of mandatory detention. If I apprehend you, you are automatically detained first. It used to be different, right? If you had an asylum claim, right, no criminal record, you might be remanded to a sponsor or to a family member where you could await your immigration hearings and then play out your status that way. Maybe you weren't able to work, but at least you were not incarcerated. But now there's this idea of mandatory, everybody gets detained. I kind of see that as a profit play. Or is it a security play? I'm not quite sure. I just want to hear your thoughts on how you see mandatory detention.
Mandatory detention is this framework, like I said, that started in the late 80s and expanded significantly in the 90s, in 1996, where, it just said, okay, here, we're just going to eliminate due process for large categories of immigrants. And we're going to eliminate due process specifically for people who have certain criminal convictions and for people who arrived in the country very recently. And so they don't get due process. But then there's still so many more immigrants who might not have, a quote unquote aggravated felony that would subject them to mandatory detention, or they're undocumented and they've been in the country or they're seeking asylum, et cetera. And those individuals were not subject to mandatory detention. But it's always been a sort of tool to expand the scope of who could be detained more. And I don't know if I would say it's as much, sure, like Geo Group or CCA, like Core Civic and these private prison companies play a role in creating harsher sentencing. But a lot of times there's a lot of incentives locally for this. So, a lot of members of Congress who might be perceived as being better on these issues sometimes are hesitant to block harsh legislation because their locality might have a private prison in it, and the job, like people locally are dependent on the job. So I think, when we think about profit motive, I think it always lends itself to here are these corporations that are benefiting from this. But actually, I think there's an important piece of this is about these the prison system and the quote unquote prison industrial complex plays such a huge role in the local economy. And so, in Louisiana, which has the highest incarceration rate in the world, and they tried to address this, they ended up, reducing the population of people who are in prison. But then they had all these empty beds. And then in the first Trump administration, they just came in and they were like, well, we're going to make these all into ICE detention centers. And so Louisiana has some of the highest rates now of ICE detention, which wasn't the case 10 years ago. And so I think that plays a significant role when we think about those profit motive things. But coming back to this point around mandatory detention, and I really think just looking back a year from now, when I think about a year previously, there was this bill called the Lake and Riley Act that passed in January. It was the first bill that Trump signed. And it was one of those situations where it was a moral panic around this really severe, crime that happened in Georgia. And again, you had Senators Ossoff and Warnock supporting this. You had multiple Democrats supporting this bill. And what it said is that immigrants who aren't even convicted, but are merely charged with theft-related crimes are subject now to mandatory detention. And so this is, again, a moral panic. You have these moments when politicians capitalize on a moral panic, and mandatory detention is the thing always on the table. How do we make it harsher? This is a tool to make things harsher. And then the Trump administration, not even pass any laws, just start saying we're going to start mandatorily detaining everyone. And so I think it's, mandatory detention is an important thing to understand.
Well, in that vein, to go on to sort of the next category, because I'm not kidding, I could talk to you about this complex issue for days because it is that complex and inhumane. It appears to me, as a reporter specifically about this particular issue of detention or apprehension, that the goal here is to deport people. The goal is to get them out of the country. So let me tell you that I'm going to detain you because you have a traffic violation that you didn't pay your ticket for, and we're going to detain you, and your next court hearing is going to be in 3 years. So you're going to have to be in detention for a long time before you get your hearing, and here is a piece of paper that you can sign and go home today. And we'll maybe even give you some money to go home today. So that to me feels like an incentive to not languish in detention and to go back to your country of origin. And that seems to be the goal, to fill this quota, to get rid of anything that's called immigrant. Do you see it that way?
Absolutely. There's no question. I mean, people are so isolated when they're in detention. Most detention centers are far from communities, far from people's families or legal services or, medical care. I mean, the conditions inside detention are so terrible. So I think there's multiple sort of pieces here where it's one part of the role of detention, especially whenever detention started to grow on the border, was this is a way to deter, which it doesn't really deter. But their strategy was, if we tell them that this is what's going to happen, less people will come. That didn't actually work. But now I think in these conditions, especially when you hear these stories of immigrants being, taken to a mega prison in El Salvador or to the African continent to be detained in a place that they've never heard of before, there is a lot of fear. So it does two things. One, it's for the people who are on the outside who are I could get targeted. There is this sort of forced attrition of maybe it's time for me to leave now, or maybe there's got to be some way. And people, it's understandable. It's really scary. You don't want to be in these detention centers where people aren't getting medical care. A few dozen people died last year in detention. The conditions are so bad. So that's part of it. But then once you're in detention, because the conditions are so bad, then there's another layer of will you do voluntary departure? Will you sign this over? And so there is no question that the whole goal of the detention system is to make the case to people to either not come, or if they're here, to leave, or once they're inside, to sign away their rights.
So on that particular subject, Congressman Ro Khanna visited a detention facility in his district. He said he posted something, I think it was today or yesterday, he posted something about speaking to 47 individuals. He was allowed into the detention facility. He spoke to 47 different individuals about the conditions within this particular facility. And to a man, everybody saying to him, I have the list here, inadequate medical care, food was, they say, subhuman, overcrowded conditions, no time outside or an hour outside. Conditions in the facility were difficult to sleep. I mean, the list goes on and on. It feels like nobody's even following any sort of protocol that are on the books on how you're supposed to treat people when you detain them. Those sort of rules and regulations seem to be thrown out the window now. We can just treat people like a herd of cattle.
I mean,
or worse.
So there's a couple things I'll say about this. One is that, like, everything you named has been an issue with the detention system for decades. Like, none of those things are new. They're just worse than they were, or there's more places, there's more people in the system. So all those things are exacerbated.
But where's the American Red Cross? I know Amnesty International published a report about torture in some of these detention facilities, but where's the international community? Where are all these human rights organizations screaming bloody murder if the United States is treating people like this on a regular basis?
I mean, I think that's a good question. I would love for there to be more engagement on this question. There's, the conditions are so bad. And when you think about things like indefinite detention, you don't think about the U.S. Like, people don't generally think about the U.S., but this is happening in the U.S. On this point about just sort of rules and regulation, the one thing I'll say is that, there has been a lot of work to create better conditions in detention. This is a lot of what happened in the Obama years. Like, how do we get all these facilities up to code? How do we consolidate the system? And they started working with more private prison companies. So actually, under the Obama administration, the number of the sort of capacity of private prisons went up 20% because they were like, here are these companies ready to play ball. They're going to create conditions that we want. They're going to create better detention centers, and it won't be as bad for these individuals. But the reality is it was still bad. I mean, the conditions are just generally bad. Most of these facilities are meant for short-term stays, but people will be there, like I said, for months or years. And so you don't have things like outdoor recreation. Oftentimes whenever people are sick, they're just like, drink water, take an Advil. That's it. There's no incentive to really care for people. And going back to this point around the political economy, you look at some of these places and again, this is the sort of narrative around private prisons, which is absolutely true. They're trying to cut costs, et cetera. But you look at a place like Etowah County in Alabama, where the sheriff actually, took like I think it was like $700,000, something. It was a lot of money, where that money should have been going to food provision. And you look at the food there, people were being served food that was rotten, that had maggots in it, like terrible food. And then he had a beach house that was an equivalent amount of money. And it's like they are also cutting costs to, like, these local sheriffs who see themselves as these sort of cowboys, like protecting the homeland. They are also cutting costs to either like bring more money in for themselves or bring money in for these counties that are really struggling. So that's also like a part of this too. That all of detention is outsourced. So there's only 5 facilities that ICE owns and operates in the country. Everything else is about sort of a bottom line of whether if it's revenue for the private prison company or for these like local counties that are like, we need some revenue as well. And this is the number one reason when we were in a place where we were having all these anti-detention campaigns and we're really successful, one of our biggest challenges to get a local community to say, no, we don't want detention, is that their fear of losing jobs and their fear of losing these federal contracts and the money that came in with them.
So everybody's feasting off of the trough of federal dollars that have been appropriated for this detention system, or whatever they're calling it themselves. I mean, it's massive, and it's the largest that it's ever been. The budget has ballooned to $175 billion with the big, beautiful bill. So, we're just starting to see those dollars being spent. And I think they're going to be spent, as you're suggesting, haphazardly, in corrupt ways. People are going to be taking advantage of the system, and the immigrant themselves, I'm assuming, don't have a say. Is there a complaint system? Is there a place where I can file any kind of a document for the way that I'm being treated? I mean, where's the oversight here?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the big things that's been a shift. And, as somebody who has worked around the system for a long time, I have a lot of critiques of the oversight system that existed prior. I think a lot of it was a sham, but still, there were things that were important. It was important for somebody to be able to file a complaint with the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties within DHS and ICE, and to make sure, you had a detention ombudsman. Again, I have critiques of those things. I actually don't think they worked particularly well, but now there isn't even a pretense. They've just gotten rid of all that. So actually inspections are not happening. Even those sham inspections are that much more not happening. So there isn't like a tool for us to say, hey, this is how these things are shifting. And a lot of times, that was a tool we used. Oh, look at this conditions report. Like, we can use this to have a conversation with members of Congress, or to make the case against these facilities, and work with reports from people inside, with journalist reports, and then also these like sort of internal reports, and all of that combined would help us make the case. But now you don't even have those. And then that lack of oversight and that lack of ability to know, like, training for people working with immigrant populations, where, you're working in so many different languages. There's so much there that there's not even a pretense to do that anymore. There's so much just like, we're warehousing these individuals, and not a care for their safety or well-being or their health, which, again, I don't think it was strongly there before, but now it's like actively not there.
It's actively not there. They don't give two shits about somebody in detention. And if there's a complaint, so what? You're an immigrant. You're a criminal, and you're lucky that you get one meal a day, or, if you do get to see a doctor. I mean, they're just thumbing their nose at any sort of humanitarian laws on the books. So that's what I'm hearing. I'm assuming that you're hearing the same thing.
And yeah, I think that's 100% true. And like I said, even before, when the system was bad, it's like you said, it's a jumping of scale. So it's just like hundreds and thousands more people are now experiencing this over the course of a year. They
haven't started to spend the dollars. I mean, they're starting to spend the dollars. They're building more facilities. So I'm wondering, sort of we're not at the end of the conversation, but like in the last chunk of this conversation, I want to know how you're going to even battle this. I know you have a coalition of membership, people who are in each state monitoring all of this and legislating and advocating. But the government has gone oversize here.
But I think what we have right now is like, public opinion is much more with us. And so how do we garner that support? How do we bring people into the fight? How do we uplift these stories? How do we do the work to care for people who are in detention, do everything we can to get them out, to support their families? And so there's a lot of layers of work happening, from the very specific case of somebody who got caught up in the system and telling their story, to the facility itself and what's happening there and how it's changing, and kind of documenting that, to having those conversations with lawmakers at the state level, to pushing members of Congress to do visits like Representative Ro Khanna did. Like, those things are so, so important, and building up that support. And in these places, like the Everglades detention camp which was called Alligator Alcatraz in Florida. There was a really successful effort by indigenous communities there and groups like Earth Justice to say, no, we're going to, litigate against the sort of, because of the environmental conditions of this place. And so I think it's really important for us right now to think about, okay, here's the site. What can we do? What are sort of, environmental justice strategies? What are strategies around zoning? What are other ways we can throw a wrench in it? And even if we lose, it's important that we wage that fight. and build. And I do think at some point there is going to be another opening for us, like there was in 2020, 2021, where we won so many campaigns and shifted the narratives. And so I think our work right now is to kind of really stay in line with that and do the work to kind of like tell this story, to document, to support people as much as we possibly can, and stay true to our values and like our vision for this work, which is we don't believe people should be detained.
Well, to that point, because that's the last thing on my list, to have this discussion with you, and thank you for your time. I mean, it's for me as a journalist, and I'm supposed to be objective here, it's the most shocking abuse of human rights in this country, I find to be the way that immigrants are detained and processed. The way that they're apprehended, the process that they have to go through, the maze of confusion that they're subjected to, the conditions. I mean, the entire gamut of what an individual who, for the most part, is fleeing turmoil of one form or another, is subjected to, I find to be so highly abusive in the United States, where you would hope that doesn't happen. But, you know, those are days gone by. Your charter, if I were to look on your website, is to eradicate detention facilities, is to get rid of them, period. They shouldn't exist in the United States. It feels like that ship has already sailed, you know, because we're in this mess. But talk to me a little bit about what life would look like in the United States without a detention facility. How can you even advocate for getting rid of an entire system of corporations and government laws and this zeal to get 100,000 people in a detention facility? So it feels like you're up against it to me.
I mean, the thing about immigration detention, it's sort of connected to a lot of other things. It's connected to the prison industrial complex, the U.S., again, world's leading incarcerator. It's connected to what's happening at the border and the militarization there. It's connected to, you know, U.S. like wars abroad and imperialism and globalization and the sort of conditions that have led to so many people to flee their home countries. And so the thing I say often is like, it feels overwhelming, but actually like it's connected to, you know, issues of like women's rights and, you know, workers' rights. It's about labor. It's connected to so much. And so sometimes it feels overwhelming, but I also think it's an opportunity for us to say, okay, how can we understand all of these conditions and this be a place where we can see some of these connections being made? And the conditions in which detention doesn't exist, to me, is when more people have that freedom to stay, that freedom to move, which is really essential also, and that freedom to thrive and find the things that they need in their lives and be able to live more fulfilling lives. And so for me, ending immigration detention is both about, okay, maybe I actually don't think it would be hugely significant to like say we're no longer going to have detention. We make that into law and then we shut down these facilities. Maybe they become like these former sites of Japanese American incarceration in the 1940s, where we go to them now and say, you know, never again. This is not a thing that we should have done. And it's a place of learning, or, you know, in these localities where people are really dependent on the federal funds and the jobs that are provided, thinking about alternative economies. Like, what could that look like? Again, so much of our challenge on fighting mass incarceration is the political economy that's tied up with it at the local level. And how do we do that work to say, is this what we want our money going to? And this conversation has happened when it comes to, you know, moving away from fossil fuels and what does like a more green economy look like? What does a just transition look like? So I think that's a conversation too that's happening around detention, around prisons generally. So from my perspective, so much like, yes, I actually don't think it would be that hard. I think it would be we didn't have this system some 45 years ago in the way it exists now. Even in the last 25 years, the system was not what it is now. Like it even, you know, when you look at the pandemic in that moment, the detention system went down to 14,000 people at any given time. It's significantly reduced, and it was fine and everything was okay. And so I think for me, I both want to hold that sort of bigger picture vision of what does it mean for our communities to be able to thrive, to have that freedom to move, to have that freedom to stay, but also we don't have to make this so hard.
If I were to distill it down from my understanding of what you just said, is to create an environment within the United States that is more welcoming to immigrants as opposed to punitive, to create a system where they do come into the United States and fill a need and are welcome, and we're not punishing them for who and what they are. And secondarily, maybe the United States could invest in other opportunities instead of incarceration, to create that kind of an economy. So those are the places where you focus. Do I have that right?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right.
It sounds simple, but we don't have a country where immigrants, to me, feel like they are welcome. I see them getting tackled by masked men in unmarked vehicles, and that seems to be okay. I see it every day on social media. So I don't see that as a welcoming environment.
I think that's right. And to me, I think, again, we have sometimes these conversations become like narrowly focused on, is this legal, or let's have a legal strategy. And it's like, I really want people to pay. The thing about detention that I think is important to learn is like, we have to pay attention to the infrastructure. That bill that passed in July is, to me, the most significant thing that happened last year in terms of where we're going and what that means, and what that's going to look like this year. And so really understanding where our tax dollars go.
You're talking about the big, beautiful bill, right? And the money appropriated for immigration.
I don't want to call it that, but yes. But I really do think that it's so much easier to build these systems up than to take them down. And so this year, I really worry about how much the scale is going to go up. And
me too.
How permanent that becomes.
$40 plus billion to build more border security infrastructure, 10,000 more ICE agents, capacity for detention facilities at 100,000 plus. None of that looks good to me. And I'm sure in your work, where can I and others like me who are journalists, who are purveyors of information, and I don't think that the coverage is great and in depth, certainly, where should we focus? What do you think is the most effective thing to raise consciousness?
I think focusing on telling those stories that are harder to tell, because when you look at the people who were sent to Eswatini and to South Sudan, these are mostly men who had really harsh criminal convictions, had past murder convictions, but humanizing those individuals, do they deserve this? We're just so ready as a society to dispose of people. But when I think about somebody like Tuan Phan, who was, a refugee, legal permanent resident who, came here when he was really young, ended up in a gang, had a murder conviction when he was 18, served 25 years in prison, was being released, and now he's stuck in South Sudan. That is not okay. Yes, what does it mean to pay your debt to society? And I worry sometimes that this kind of, obsession with innocence versus no, their whole strategy is to just go after everyone. Why are we trying to pit communities against each other? Makes it harder for us to make the case for everyone.
For my last question, I ask it frequently, and it feels kind of for rote, but I'm wondering how much hope you have, given what we're up against in 2026, because there's a lot coming on your plate this year.
I think one of the biggest challenges about this is that in those moments when we have opportunity to make change, if a Democrat is in office, people think everything's fine. So there's not as much energy around it and energy around putting the pressure on. Whereas now people are really clear on how bad the conditions are. And I think for me, I had a book that came out last year, and one of the things that's been so beautiful about it is I'm spending a lot of people who are reading it are young people who are college students, people kind of engaging with it. And those conversations to me give me a lot of hope. Like, I think in so many ways, people are seeing through what's happening, understanding, like the veneer is off. Like, we don't have to pretend anymore. Like, let's just have a real conversation about, this is about racism. This is about xenophobia. This is about, this sort of like effort to go after people who don't agree with who's in power right now. And so, like, we can have more honest conversations. People care so much. I mean, I think especially working in the sort of like nonprofit world, like the people who are making real impact right now are these like neighborhood groups that have gotten together to protect their community members and are building together. And to me, that gives me a lot of hope, because the only way we win is if it's not somebody like me who's like, this is what I do as work, but ordinary people who say, no, I don't want this to happen in my community. I don't want this to happen with my tax dollars. I don't want this to happen in my name. And so I do have a lot of, I'm scared. I'm terrified. I'm shocked. Like I said, 20 plus years of doing this work, and this is beyond my imagination of how bad it could have gotten. But I do think if we get to the other side of this, the opportunities for change could be immense. And I think that's what we have to work on right now, is like building up to make sure we're ready.
Do you feel like the times that are so shocking, I think that word is apropos, builds a little bit more resiliency and muscle? Like, you guys are getting actually stronger because of the times?
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of burnout, and it's really hard. It's really emotionally hard, but I do think we are getting stronger. And I think that sort of new energy also brings a lot of that in for us as well. Like, it's exciting to have more people engaged. And so just trying to hold on to that and make sure that we keep people engaged and figure out ways to like we're not going to win every campaign. That's just a reality, but maybe we throw a little wrench and it's something we can celebrate, like trying to make sure that we're just kind of keeping that drumbeat.
Thank you for the time that you've given us today. I really appreciate it. Thank you for listening to The Raid, available wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about our guests and the subjects we cover, please visit our website at theraidpodcast.org.